pace.
And I'm joined in studio by Kenny Deery, Chief Executive of Galway Chamber of Commerce. Kenny, good morning to you. Thank you indeed for joining us today. And I'm joined on the line by Mary Mullins, SIPTU organiser in Galway. Mary, good morning to you as well.
Good morning, Keith.
Kenny, how do you react indeed to that statement and moving forward?
I think, Keith, if we look at many of our member companies and many employers around Galway, there's a realisation that if they're to retain staff, they need to pay competitive market rates, and many are already. They also need to create a safe working environment, a positive, inclusive culture. And I know the wage piece is particularly a discussion point at the moment because of the evolving geopolitical situation and the impact that's having on costs. But certainly many of the member companies that we have are already proactively moving in that space, and we're even hearing a very mature discussion, let's say, in an industry around tourism, hospitality and retail who have identified struggles with staff, and many of the employers in that space are saying we need to pay more, we need to create a career structure within this industry, we need to look after people. And they know that if it's a case they don't, and they're just paying minimum wage and they're not creating that culture and also giving a sense that there's a career trajectory here, they're going to lose their staff.
And you see the difficulty there is poaching staff from one company to another. So if you come and work for me, Kenny, I look after you, I'll give you healthcare and give your family healthcare. Like, all of these bonuses are affecting, because it's a small pot, really.
Mm-hmm. It is, and it'll be, in many companies, they really have to focus on getting this right. Because that's what will help retain their loyal staff. And the last thing that any organisation wants is churn of staff members, because there's a significant cost. You have a customer service impact, irrespective of what industry you're in. So I think many of the organisations, and certainly our members, we're hearing very strong messaging around the efforts that they're going to attract people, to retain people, to try and help support accommodation in some stages. So what the Taoiseach has said, it's not new. Many companies are trying to build it into their budgets. But I think overall we have to remember that there's only a certain amount of pie. And if it's a case that there's going to be inflation or increases in wages, which we are seeing, and as you say, in the overall package, then that has to be paid for somehow, and that's going to feed into in pricing for the consumers. Some will operate on leaner operations, but being honest, the overall pot or the overall pie has to increase, and that'll see certain items becoming more expensive.
We had earlier on, you were at a meeting in Oranmore at the time with Paul Gallagher, former president of the IHF and manager of Buzzfield Hotel in Dublin, and he was saying that some of the hotels in Dublin, that 2 to 3% of their bed stock has gone to give accommodation to staff.
Correct. And it's part of the package that some properties are having to do to get key hires in. And then once you get certain anchor, let's say certain roles, chefs are critical in the hospitality industry, for example. Many properties are having at this stage to be innovative in terms of how they provide accommodation as part of a package, how they provide transport, safe transport to and from work if people are living a bit away.
Would you see your members trying to do that?
Absolutely, yeah. They are, and as I say, it's part of an overall package, and there's a cost to that. But equally, they know that if it's a case that you don't get these key roles filled and that you don't retain the talent that you have, then you're on a footing to nowhere, because you're then going back recruiting, you're churning team members, and there's an impact on service if you're talking hospitality industry, for example.
Yeah.
But right across the board, we're seeing employers going to extra lengths to try and attract the right people and give them a package that will see them stay with the firm, with the organisation for a longer period of time. Now, remember when I started working, you joined an organisation and you remained there.
You never left it, but you did.
Well, I did. It took me long enough. I was cushy enough for a while, but I think the average length of service now in an employment for many staff, it's about 2.8 years. So it's already short enough as it is, statistically. And the last thing you want is people hopping from one role to another because they're getting better offers. So employers really have to get ahead of this, and I think the Taoiseach is right in signalling it. And the length of time that he's indicating for those who haven't caught up will certainly have to, because the pressure will come on them. They'll lose their teams, they'll lose their talent.
I go to Mary in one moment. Can I ask you about multinationals, and because you represent a huge amount of them, and a huge amount of them are members as well. Is there any worry in your mind that, if the cost of living keeps going the way it is in Ireland, that the mothership in the States or elsewhere will say, guys, time to bail from here. This is just too expensive for us to continue?
I think they evaluate competitiveness on a quarterly basis forensically. And when we're looking, absolutely. And the leaders of the sites in Galway, no more than everywhere else in Ireland, have to pitch on a quarterly basis as to how they are more competitive than their sister operations in India, in Africa, in other locations.
Really?
Right? There's a forensic analysis, and I think we take that for granted. We look at the brands and you look at the larger buildings and you think, wow, it's great we have those. But I think we need to take cognizance of the fact that there's
they
a quarterly...
fight on a quarterly basis, 4 times a year.
Absolutely. in terms of their competitiveness and why they should get sustained investment in the long term. Now, many of the companies, when they're investing in a place like Galway, they're taking a long-term view. They're taking a 10, 15 and 20-year view. They're looking at the political climate. So Ireland, thankfully, has a stable political climate. And I think now more than ever, we realise the value of that. There's an acceptance that the cost of doing business here is higher than in other locations. But once you bring in the political stability, you bring in the access to talent, you bring in the fact that we have now 2 universities in Galway, for example, and we have a very strong kind of positive culture, positive city living experience and lived experience for many of the employees. We're a diverse location. They give the counterbalance to the competitiveness piece in one point, but it's all part of a pie, and without a doubt we would take it for granted at our peril if it's a case that we didn't think that the long-term analysis isn't and gone through on a quarterly basis. I think the big factor that's driving increasing costs at the moment, as we know, is obviously the situation in Ukraine, and that's a global impact. So no matter what site locations they have around the world, there will be some adverse impacts on cost at the moment. So no one has a sense of how long this is going to go on for, but certainly this is reviewed quarterly, and I think we can never take for granted the investments that we have.
I never knew that, to be quite honest. I thought I knew a lot of things in life. Mary, good morning to you, Mary Mullins. Thank you for joining SIPTU organiser. How difficult is it for you representing your members, indeed, who are staff members right across the board, going in and knocking on the door and saying, we need to talk about wages, Mary?
Well, it's very difficult in these current times, Keith. Prior to now, we had the COVID pandemic, which eliminated completely physically knocking on any doors at all.
Yeah.
And as we emerge from that, where we are getting back, in the interface with our members and meeting them and physically seeing and hearing the financial pain and burden that they are carrying, we now have other economic climates going on, like inflation and the cost of living is at an all-time high. And whilst SIPTU acknowledges a 60% median wage as the basis for the proposed rate, we do need to highlight that the Low Pay Commission in fact recommends the rate could be adjusted up to 66% of the median wage in the future. Another thing that SIPTU strongly believe in, whilst the proposal is there to implement this down the road is simply not going to cut the mustard for the workers that we represent. Yeah. We need this implemented immediately. Like the workers in the sectors throughout Ireland that we represent, low pay is a huge, huge problem. And Galway is no different, where I'm representing members in the services division. Like, we have a situation where over 50% of hospitality workers, in the sector are low paid. And what we're dealing with day to day are the difficulties of prioritising their rent or their mortgage, fuel. Do they keep fuel in the car to ensure they can get to work? Do they miss a meal in order for that? Do they miss something that they have to pay for their children? What we have here, our workers are being driven. They're being driven down into poverty. And it's very, very difficult going to the employer then looking for the wage increase in this current time. So what we really, really and truly need at this moment in time for all workers in the sector is the government to step it up a gear with this proposal and implement it immediately.
So rather than getting up to 2026, so €10.50 to €12.17, you say do that in what space of time, Mary Mullins?
It needs to come in straight away. 2026 is not good enough. There is in that report the discretion to bring it forward if needs be, given the economic status at the time. We have never been in such an economic crisis that we are in this point in time. It has not hit, cost of living has not hit the all-time high that it's hit in a very, very long period of time, and it's not set to stop anytime soon. There's economists out there predicting that inflation is going to further increase before the end of this year. So action is needed straight away. When you look at minimum wage in Ireland, it's currently $10.50 an hour. We can't forget about under 20s. So we could have a 19-year-old doing the exact same work as a 26-year-old, but because they're under 20, they don't even get $10.50 an hour. But yet they still have the same bills to pay. They still have the same cost of living to look out for. $10.50 an hour. When you take out your $10.50 an hour wage, and $2.15, $2.16 is for 1 litre of fuel. 1 litre of fuel might not necessarily get you to work. So we need this in, and we need it ASAP.
Mary, we spoke yesterday morning to Fintan Maher from Simon Galway. It was about a swimming event taking place next Tuesday, 21st. But he was actually saying on air that he was actually surprised the amount of young people that were coming to the services of Galway Simon who are homeless. And I mean, from what you're saying there, somebody who's on that minimum wage, I mean, they just can't afford to get accommodation.
Absolutely, because, like I said, 18-year-olds don't automatically qualify for 10.50 an hour. I think it's 8.45, but for that 8.45, there's over €2 there in the difference of what's being paid. But you don't have the landlord or the ESB or the grocer in the shop saying, "Oh, hold on, I beg your pardon, you're on less money because you're under 20. Let's knock off a fifth of your bill there." They still have the same costs, but they're doing the same work and they're not getting the same rate. So that is another challenge of this whole pay scenario that also needs corrected, and it needs to be corrected immediately also.
Kenny, what's your reaction? You're listening to Mary Mullins there, who's the SIPTU organiser in Galway. How do you react? I mean,
I think certainly this conversation, it's not a new one. I think it's come to the fore more as a result of what's happened over the last 6 to 12 months. I think if we look at businesses, though, that's about a 20% increase in the base wage that's being discussed in let's say going from your 10 odd up to 12 odd euro. And no business in their budgets are going to be able to absorb, no business in their budgets are going to be able to absorb that in an immediate impact. Yeah. This is something that has to be, and I think what Leo Varadkar is talking about is very much a phased basis that businesses can plan around it. They can build their operating budgets around it. They can project forward. If anything was to be done immediately, as is being suggested by Mary, and I don't take from the merits of what she's saying, it would need intervention. It would need a form of a new EWSS type thing to sustain and support kind of the working poor and keeping people in employment, because this is the critical thing. If it's a case that remember, there's only a certain pot that's divided up for wages in any projection, in any set of accounts, and if it's a case that more has to be paid to individuals, then there's a less amount of people that will be receiving it. And the last thing we want to see is people falling out of employment, because that's only going to make their situation worse. So certainly if there's any suggestion about an immediate increase at that level, that would have to be supported with government intervention to keep people in employment. There's no other way that businesses are going to be able to sustain that level of a dramatic increase straight away.
But I mean, would your members of the Galway Chamber of Commerce that Mary is talking about and we're talking about, and it's just a general discussion, surely they're not making that amount of money that they can absorb that increase that Taoiseach is talking about? If we're being realistic here now. I
think over time, if people recognise, and as I say, if we look even at the tourism and hospitality industries, there's about 20,000 people working in the city and around the city in that space. It's a significant employer. And I think what Mary was talking to is, is about 50% are in what they identify as the vulnerable space. That means already over half employees are being better looked after. And I think there's a huge appetite within business. They want to, as I say, retain people. Now more than ever, this has been a huge challenge. It's not just an Irish issue. I've travelled a bit in the last month and I'm seeing restaurants in the UK and the US only opening 5 days because they can't get staffing for 7 days a week. So I think it's important we remember that as well. But the only way that businesses could sustain this in the long term is with advance notice, with planning, and with the ability that their prices will be increasing, because if this is to work out, then additional income needs to come in to be able to pay these people more. Right, because there isn't enough in the margins of the businesses at the moment. Many will say at the end of the year, by the time they've their revenue paid, by the time they've their accountants, their audit complete and everything else, there's very, very little, if anything, left for themselves.
Mary Mullins, can I come back to you finally on this one? Just in relation to employers, should they open their books, or do they open their books to you to say, Mary, there's not much more I can do?
Absolutely, it needs to happen. It happens in some circumstances. It happens in some circumstances. We would have had situations in the past when we'd have been going through pay agreements if there wasn't a claiming of an inability to pay, where some employers would willingly open their books to show where they're at. But I think getting back to the point of being able to pay or not being able to pay, it needs to get to the focus. The low pay, we're paying a very high cost in this country for a low pay. And it needs addressing, and the government do need to address it. Like we did have the situation last year where some employers groups did come out and say we're unable to get staff. It's because of the rate of the pandemic unemployment payment, and there was pressure put on there that it needs to be ceased because we can't get people back out into the workforce. Yeah. Well, the pandemic unemployment payment, it has now ceased, and the problem still remains, and that's because the problem has been there for quite some time. It's just been highlighted even more since the pandemic, and indeed the war happening as well in the Ukraine.
I think also indeed so many people went home, Kenny Deery, and left the hospitality industry, went home, and have now decided, look, I'm going staying at home, rear my family at home.
Many went home, and also there's quite a cohort who decided to go back and retrain, and they took up many of the offerings, be it through skill nets, through other training programs, and they're now in industry. They're working in, if we took a look at a Galway level, I know quite a number of people who were in hospitality and they're now working in industry. They're working in assembly line. They feel it's more social. The hours, they're less antisocial. They're getting paid at a better rate. There's terms and conditions and there's a strong culture. And I think that's also contributed to it. So certainly immigration and retraining.
Mary Mullins, thank you indeed for joining us today. SIPTU organiser in Galway, Kenny Deery, Chief Executive of Galway Chamber. Perhaps the two of you should have a coffee, Mary, someday.